And we're back. Hello, everyone. I am Sarthak Kaul, and this is True Calling. I'm thrilled to have Paritosh Kanoria. He's the founder of RECO Education, which is a edtech startup based in India with the mission to transform education from rigid systems into empowering experiences that put students in the driver's seat. In this episode, we dove into the roots of his educational passion, reimagining learning through play, exploring the evolving Indian education system, and tackling the impact of AI on modern learning. If you're curious about redefining education for a better future, you wouldn't want to miss this conversation. And with this, we are officially over the 20 episode mark, which I am super stoked. I took a week off to one, go for an ayahuasca ceremony, which is its own conversation, which is going to be coming in the next few weeks. Lots of learnings, feeling much lighter. But let's dive straight into this conversation, and I'll see you guys very soon. So I actually wanted to start off with Banaras. You know this. I first visited Banaras during the winter break of my third year at Stanford. When I returned to college in January 2018, I took my first religious studies class. I ended up writing my college thesis on Hindu temples and later pursued a master's in religion at University of Chicago. Today you run RECO Education, and we'll get more into that. You said that your first visit there reminded you of your childhood a lot, visiting temples every day, listening to your maid's version of the Ramayana at night, drawing gods with pencils and showing your drawings to your parents. Where does this passion for fixing in some ways or reimagining education come from? Where in your childhood does it come from?
So, both my parents have really influenced my interest in education today, but I think in very, very different ways. My mother has always been an educator. She was a nursery school teacher for about 15 years in Mumbai, and then she shifted over to special needs. So, she specialized in dyslexia, working with children with dyslexia, and then began to work with children's parents so she could sort of reach a larger scale of children. So I've always been influenced by her. I've seen her around kids and how good she is at teaching them things. And of course, she was an excellent teacher for me as well. I think she approaches education with a lot of love and gets completely involved in whatever activity she's doing with children. And I can see how children respond to that. So I've always wanted to do something where I could have that level of a deep connection with someone else professionally. My dad.
How did she go about that, by the way? Did you like notice something particular about how she went about teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the visual memories that I have of her teaching are when she would read children's stories with kids and she would enact the characters in those stories. And she would be an actor in that setting. And the children would look at her completely gobsmacked because they couldn't tell whether she was their mother or their aunt or their grandmother or their teacher or if she was actually the character that she was playing. So I think I really just saw the role of imagination play out there, and I found that extremely fascinating.
Wow. And what about your father?
My father is a businessman, so he runs a sugar manufacturing plant in Uttar Pradesh, and he's never been involved in education as such. Certainly not been involved in my education. I remember when I would go back from school, oftentimes he wouldn't know which grade I'm in. If I had a post in class or in school, like captain or something, he had absolutely no idea what was going on there. But he always thought education was very, very important, and he read very frequently too. I actually remember that there was one point in my school journey where, from the school side, there was a little bit of a mess up where we were supposed to complete the portion of a particular subject over 2 years. But around 1.5 years into that 2 year period, we realized that we had been studying the wrong portion the entire time. And so our school kind of called all of our parents over to sort of say that, okay, we have to do 2 years worth of portion in just 6 to 8 months. And everyone was kind of freaking out. And my mom wasn't in town, and that's why my dad came. He was never involved with school. And he just couldn't understand that this was a problem. He was like, oh, so they'll just read more literature. What's the problem? So he had a very different take on education. He wasn't particularly interested in grades. And at that time, frankly, I was a very average student too. So it wasn't as though he was kind of seeing that I was doing well and thinking that everyone might be doing as well. He was just interested in me learning and me reading as much as possible.
Interesting. In high school, how were you as a student?
Academically, I was not interested. I was not serious until grade 9. Before that, I was very playful. I was very social. I was always kind of making friends and having fun and making noise around the school. That continued even once I began to get serious. But I wouldn't say that academics was kind of everything that I was all about. I loved to get very involved in the projects I was doing. So I did the IB, we had IAs and IEEs, and I got really interested in those kinds of assignments. I did visual arts as well. How else was I as a student? I would say not stressed out.
Oh wow, interesting. I feel like I had the opposite experience in high school. Not really stressed out, but more so there was always I knew there were expectations in the family on how I need to be as a student, and there's a lot of focus. There was a lot of focus on that for me and for my brother. How did your parents go about expectations? And what do you see right now with the expectations that parents have, since you're now very closely dealing with kids of similar ages?
Right, right. I think parents really, overall, that I've seen, parents are very concerned about kids getting into college and getting good jobs going forward. I think it all comes from a very genuine place of them wanting to see their kids thrive. But I do think that oftentimes it does come back to that. That's completely fair enough. Education has often been seen, has always been seen as a pathway to a job, essentially, in the future. But at the
Mm.
same time, you do have some parents who do have higher expectations of education. They want their kids to get good placements and good jobs, but they also think that schools and education should be giving something else to their students.
Well, what are the current problems that you're seeing with the education system that you constantly think about?
Right. I think about how we're not holding ourselves to as high a standard as we can. Schools are places that can help you develop in so many more ways than just developing into a good test taker. And oftentimes we don't allow schools the freedom that they require to experiment with students more.
Why is
I think
that?
that I think it's because the whole system seems to be set up, and everyone it's just kind of commonly understood that grades are the most important thing in university admissions. They also think that grades are the most important things in job recruitment, and often they think that grades are kind of like very high predictors of how one does in life as well. So there's just a very high emphasis on.
Is that true? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I do think that grades are very important for university admissions, especially if you're talking about UK universities or US universities. But I was having a conversation with some other friends who went to college with me, and we all agreed that grades are very important. But once you reach a certain level of good grades, then it's not a matter of getting 1 or 2 or 3% more. At that point, it's a matter of doing a range of things besides your grades that show you as a multidimensional kind of person and show that you have more to bring to the table. Because ultimately, if the question paper was slightly different, you might have got 3 points more or 3 points less, right? But these other things that are things that actually show more about who you are.
You've talked about uh, bringing soul to education. So you said, to me, returning soul to education is about helping students develop a more personally meaningful relationship with it, and thereby a deeper relationship with themselves, others, and our world. What does this mean to you? How does this play into what you are doing at RECO?
Right. I mean, I think in some schools of Indian philosophy, the question arises as to why existence exists, right? And then the personified kind of question from that is why did God create the world, essentially? And one of the theories is that God created the world because God just wanted to play. That's kind of the most visceral of human instinct, or not even human instinct of all kind of conscious life, is that life wants
Hmm.
to and I think that should be sort of given more center stage when it comes to education, because learning can be seen as an activity of play. And as we all know, when you aren't thinking about stressful things and are kind of doing something with a great deeper sense of curiosity and joy, then you're more likely to learn. And there's this whole field of play based learning that we all know about.
Can you talk a little bit more about that for people that have no idea about play-based learning? What is that?
Well, think of a game. Think of any game that you played as a child where there were actually learning outcomes. So, for example, one of the games that I played as a child was Carmen San Diego. So, Carmen San Diego was this kind of criminal wearing a red suit and a red hat, and she would go all over the world, and you would have to find her. But the way that you would have to find her was to gain clues about where she might have gone based on things that people in different countries would say. So you would go from country to country and they would say, oh, I think she went to a place where people wear cowboy hats, and then you would take a flight virtually to Texas where she would be, etc. So I learned a lot about the world and what cultures are like through that game. And there's so many other types of games that you can design and play to learn different types of things.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about education as a topic. I think what I'm really curious to understand is you kind of touched on it right now, which is it's looked at as a means to something else. Learning is right now looked at as a means to get that job or go to college, and grades is like the metric for that. Grades is focused like people focus on grades more than anything else. How have you heard about this thing called as autotelic
No.
personalities or autotelic behaviors? There's certain things that we do for the sake of something else, which is what you're talking about right now. It looks like education is a means to something else. But then there are certain things that we like to do, which is where your play-based learning comes at, where you're doing the things for the sake of the thing and nothing else. But a second order effect of that is that you also learn and is that you pick up other things. But it's not the focus of it. So I really want to go more deeper into this topic because uh, like how can we reimagine education like from that perspective if formal education did not exist, how would you go about rebuilding this? What would we do in that scenario?
If formal education did not exist,
Yes.
I mean, I think that even play based learning or any kind of learning in which, as you're saying, the focus is the thing itself and the other thing is a second order result or a consequence, there should be a large degree of intentionality in the activity that the person is doing. So, for example, yes, when I was playing Carmen San Diego, as a consequence, I was learning about geography. I was in that moment very much focused on finding her, right? So the game was created. Um, the game created an environment for me in which intentional learning could happen. The outcomes might have been very different from that, but I think it is important for an environment to be created for learning to take place, and there can be a formal mechanism for that. I'm not someone who believes that you should just give students, say, a ball of yarn and say, play, because they don't quite know what to do with the yarn. But if you give them the yarn and then you give them some kind of manual or some sort of instructions on how they could use that yarn, then they can develop a particular intention with which to approach the yarn and then go with it
Hmm.
in that direction. But then there's always the danger of taking that too far and telling them every single thing that they should be doing with the yarn, which leaves no room for creativity. So I think it's about creating a balance.
That's something you've also talked about before is like, I was very similar to you in that way. When I went to college, I started off with a very set path and like I'm gonna pursue physics and I'm gonna go just into that. But then I started taking other classes that are very interesting. I took like a seminar in the first quarter at my college, and I then just started taking different classes that just piqued my interest or curiosity. And then you had like a second set of students that like came with me from India as well, who kind of like pursued CS and or whatever subject. A lot of them was in CS, I remember. And they just kind of like went with that single-minded focus, like, yeah, I want to become an engineer with that, or go into management consulting and stuff. And for them, there wasn't so much uncertainty in that process because it was a path already kind of laid out as it was. But later on, like now, when I see them, now it's a question of how does this fit into the things that I actually enjoy doing, is the question that they're asking themselves. Whereas I think for me, and maybe for even you, from what I understand, you went much more into exploring your curiosities earlier on. And now it's like, wait, it's way more unstructured than I imagined it to be. How can I make some sense of this? So the same questions are being asked in different ways of the path. So to your point, it's like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I do know people who are very, very smart, who went to my school and are doing well paying jobs in the US, but don't feel very creative. And in fact, I just met them a few weeks ago when they all came down to Mumbai, during the winter break, as one normally does. And they feel very happy when they see others do something slightly different. I think that they don't want to become the types of people that they think they might become a few years down the line. And they're a bit sort of scared of going so far ahead in their journey to a point of essentially no return. I think that the other direction also has its challenges. So, for example, for me, we'll speak about my journey, but it was very difficult for me to conceive the type of organization I might want to start because there it wasn't as though there were any sort of frameworks that I necessarily borrowed from. It was all about kind of coming up with an idealized version of education that I would like to offer and then slowly testing it in the market and seeing what would need to be shifted in order for people to actually be able to accept it.
Where did this version come from? Is it something that you wish that existed for yourself, or you see other people wanting this? Where did that come in the first kind of conception of it?
Right. So the first program that we ran at RECO Education was called Finding Your Academic Purpose. And the entire program was about trying to see disciplines as resources for you to tackle issues in the world that you are truly passionate about. So essentially connecting the dots between your subjects, the real world, and yourself. That was kind of the goal. So I took these three things, the subjects, the real world, and yourself, and I created a curriculum that would help students put all of these three things into conversation in a structured way. This connecting of the dots was something that I wish I definitely had done in high school, um, before I went to college, because it was only in college that I began to see that these three things are quite related. The thing is that it mattered a lot in college because in college I would have to make choices of what subjects to study and courses to take based on how I perceive my relationship with those subjects, my relationship with real world problems, and the relationship between subjects and real world problems. So I sort of thought about what I would have liked to have in school before I went to college, and I designed a curriculum.
Do you see this as a mindset that is currently prevalent in India, parts of India? How do you find this when you tell people about it? What's the reaction?
I think people are interested in real world applications of knowledge, but more as a means to, again, achieve outcomes. So, for example, if you're learning about a particular concept in history, then people are like, okay, we'll take a program that has real world applications because that'll be a more fun way to learn history. But people are not often, I think, thinking about um, themselves in the context of the subject and the real world. It's still about the real world and the subject, but what about how you, in your particular historical context, what is your relationship with what you're studying? I think that's still a little bit under question.
Yeah, you're saying that people are thinking of this as a means to a job, but what job? And is that job something that you are actually interested in, or what do you think about that job? I think that questioning is a little bit, it's missing in some ways, if I understand you correctly.
So I think what was missing was that entire triangulation between the self, the real world, and the subjects. I think people make a lot of connections between two of those three nodes. So, for example, let's say subjects and the real world. When people want to study history, they would like to have real world examples or be part of the way that someone teaches history so that they can understand history better. But they're not often in that same context trying to understand for themselves who am I in the context of history. It's more about just understanding the subject itself through real world examples. If you think about the nodes
Can you
of
can you give an example of can you give an example of how you, if that's the question you ask yourself, or use anything, who am I in the context of X? How do you go about thinking about that? Because that seems like I'm understanding it, but I'm trying to understand how you would actually talk to yourself, or what would that relationship look like?
right. Okay, so when I was in college, I took a course on surgery where we were physically examining a human body, and the patient that we had cancer. And that's obviously something that could happen to any of us. And in fact, did happen to my grandfather and my grandmother. When I was learning about the human body, it wasn't just pure academic concepts because we were actually looking at a real body and cutting it open and seeing what the lung looked like. So there was that coming together of academic concepts and real world examples. But I wasn't going back home and thinking necessarily what it means for me to actually encounter a body in this way, what it means for me to have the same type of body that this person has, what it means for me to have the same dangers potentially in my life that this person had to encounter. I think that's an element of personal reflection that could be seriously integrated into the academic study of the body, which we often don't do.
How do you see that being helpful to someone, that reflection?
Absolutely. I think it makes you get more from your studies, really. I think it kind of helps you understand things more deeply because your heart is involved in them. Um, it's similar to how teachers sometimes ask students to explain things in their own words. It's when you explain something in the language that is reflective of your individuality and subjectivity, then you kind of engage in an act of translation where you take something abstract and you kind of make it your own and then it runs through your veins. It's that same type of thing that one would do if one were to go home and be like, what does it mean for me to have a body that will die? I think if I
Right.
wrestled with that question more, one experiences more gratitude, one understands concepts better because one simply feels a deeper connection with them.
I This is a very interesting topic. I want to understand in your own words what does it mean to be educated?
I think that one of the most important things about education is to learning to think for yourself. And I think that's something that's really going to sort of stay as a relevant skill, even as education gets so deeply disrupted due to artificial intelligence. Because ultimately, artificial intelligence is going to give you a lot of great ideas, maybe better ones that you could have come up with on your own within the same span of time. But ultimately, you will have to take a decision as to which of those ideas you want to go with and how you might want to tweak it for your circumstances. And I think that skill of being able to trust yourself, think for yourself, act in accordance with your principles, your goals, that's really what I think education is about. At least that's a big part of it.
How do you see that being implemented in schools? Things more around self exploration. Because, I mean, I know you were in Bombay and you were like in a IB curriculum. I was in ICSE curriculum. And a lot of the things that we did by other standards, everyone would say these were like very good schools. When it comes to, I think, more about the outcomes that they produced for the kids. But when it comes to the curriculum, I don't remember necessarily going into a personal reflection on things, on what it is that I actually find valuable or what are my values in this. It was very subject oriented, as you said. So how can we go about this? Like, where do you find this fitting into the education model?
Right. I think it's a really difficult question. I think it's a subject specific question. I think the challenge of integrating personal reflection into academic studies will be different between different subjects. So, for example, if you're in a literature class and you're thinking about characters and what their values are and how they should behave and why they act in a certain way, etc., then it might be easier for a teacher to ask you a question such as, do you respond to situations in the same way as this character? Or what should this character have done? Have you been in a situation like this before? And by reflecting on that, are quite automatically understanding a little bit more about the character itself. And at the same time, thinking about yourself in relation to that character. So it might be easy in some contexts like English, although there may be some personal reflection concepts there also, which would be a little bit more removed from the text itself. With a subject like math, might be a bit harder. I remember in the US, the government of Florida had published, sorry, in the US, there were some math textbooks that had been published, and the government of Florida decided to ban them because they contained too many social emotional learning elements in those textbooks. And I think there were various reasons that they cited for banning those textbooks, but I think one of them was valid, which is that oftentimes the social emotional concepts in that math textbook, were just completely separate from the math concepts that were also in that book. So, for example, you would have a sum written out, an exercise for someone to do, which is a purely mathematical exercise. And then on the left side or right side, there'd be a question along something like, what does courage mean to you? But that's really strange for you to look at as a student, or this question of what does courage mean to you on one side, and then this whole kind of math equation on the other side. A different way to kind of integrate personal reflection into a situation like this would be to do what a different textbook did in the same state, which was ask a question along the lines of, what does math mean to you? Or what do you enjoy about math? And that's still a personal question, but it is related to math. So I think it would be different for different subjects.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I actually want to touch on something you recently said. You talked about reading this book by Dr. John Thelen, History of American Higher Education, where you talked about the early adversities universities, the ones we even know of, Brown University, faced while securing funds, attracting students, and defining academic standards. I'm curious. So, if someone was to there's two questions there. One is, if someone was to start off to understand how we are at the current education system that we have, what are some books that you think you would recommend them to go through? That's the first question. Let's start with that.
Okay. Higher education?
What do you see as where do you see is a good place to start to understand the incentives of the education system? And when you said how you asked that question, higher education, why the distinction? What's different, I guess, in the way they're being run?
Okay. I think higher education is very different from school education because school education is quite, I mean, I'm talking about liberal arts and sciences higher education. It's a completely different type of institution because over there you have to have a very wide range of subjects. You have to give students choice between those subjects to a much greater degree than they have in school. You have to have faculty that conducts research, and you have to also necessarily most of the time make it an entirely residential campus. So it's a very different type of institution with different types of goals as well than school education. School education, is usually not a very large kind of institution, and the parents of the students all kind of know each other. So there's a much lower amount of diversity within a school. And they're definitely following a set curriculum, which might not be the case at all in higher education. So these are very different types of institutions. I don't know so much about too many books on school education, but I can tell you a little bit about some books that I've really enjoyed on education at large and particularly on higher education. So, for education at large, there's a very famous book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's by Paulo Freire. The book is all about education as a means of liberation. When you are educated, you have access to knowledge. Having access to knowledge enables you to take decisions for yourself in ways that you wouldn't have been able to do without that knowledge. So that book is extremely popular and highly influential in the field of education. There's an extremely famous philosopher called John Dewey. He's an American philosopher. He was a pragmatist. And fun fact, he was a professor at the University of Chicago in, I think, the late 1800s. And at that time, you find this really interesting, Sarthak. The departments for psychology, philosophy, and pedagogy, which is another word for how we teach, those three departments were the same department. It was
Mm.
not three separate departments. So they truly thought that the nature of reality, philosophy, the way the mind works, and how we learn are all completely integrated areas. So he's an extremely influential thinker. His works can get quite dense. So I would read someone like Philip Jackson, who explains Dewey's ideas in a more accessible way to the public. I would also really recommend Julie Rubin. So Julie Rubin is a professor of education at Harvard. She has written this wonderful book on the history of the American higher education system. And in that book, she essentially talks about what it was like to go from a religious education system. Every university was a Christian university to a secular one, and what kind of factors had to be negotiated there as we made that transition. These are three that are some of my favorites.
Man, that's those are all very diverse books, it seems like. And thank you for sharing that. Any ones you've read more to do with the Indian education system too, or where do you see the parallels there?
Right. I'm just thinking. Well, I think the Indian higher education system that I'm interested in is the liberal arts and sciences education system. And that is essentially constructed on the American model. And the American model is what Julie Rubin's book is about. I don't know what more to say about this, honestly.
Like, do you also see the Indian angle to it? Since you're like, it seems like you're very interested in. You've always been pretty interested. It seems like in religion, like Hinduism at large, but like what's happening within India. How does this sort of is there any translation from the religious aspect of it to our education system? Was the Indian education system at all built upon any religious principles as well, similar to the US education system?
So the Indian higher education system before the liberal arts universities came into India were actually more like schools. You would have teachers who would know particular subjects well, and they would teach a particular syllabus for you to learn over 3 years while you were in your bachelor's degree. And that's very similar to school, where you have kind of a set curriculum and you have a teacher who teaches that curriculum to you. I think what universities like Ashoka, Kriya, Plaksha, Flame, etc., have done is brought researchers to be teachers. So now these people who are teaching in these universities are not just disseminators of knowledge like a traditional teacher is, but also creators of knowledge themselves. So I think that's what it used to look like. And I mean, we still have most of the colleges in India still operate on that model where the teacher is not a researcher, but the new ones have a different kind of person teaching. But the religious angle, I
That's very
wouldn't.
interesting. That's very interesting. And this is something that has existed in the US, the teaching and researching at the same time in the
Yeah,
US model, would you say?
that's how it is at Stanford, Harvard, and most of these really good research universities.
That's so interesting. I feel like, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I'm saying the fact that often at these universities, it's not people who are doing active research who end up teaching you is a different question. But the ideal thing is like you have these professors who conduct research and also teach students.
Yeah, generally I've noticed, at least in the fields that I was in, like I mostly did math and physics, that the professors we had were not that interested in teaching. It was just like it was something they had to do, but again, the incentives weren't really aligned. The reason they were teaching so they could like stay and research at that campus for a longer time. So it's just like their incentives are not aligned, and so I noticed that a lot of times the professors were just there again as a means to an end situation from the other side for teaching, right? Which is interesting. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about um, artificial intelligence, just because I feel like we're now getting to a place where these tools are being used. I mean, I'm currently in a master's program at UT Austin, and we're like openly, for most of our classes, are encouraged, honestly, to use other AI tools, ChatGPT and others, to as part of our process for any like research or assignments and stuff. So where do you see with these advancements in AI happening? How is education evolving? And what would you kind of touched on it before, but what role do you think parents and teachers play in this transformation?
Right. Well, I think that it's going to become a lot easier, or it already has become a lot easier to produce drafts of things, to sometimes find resources, to develop frameworks, to begin thinking about things. And all of that is great. I think it's wonderful that so much of this can be quickened. I think that one of the problems that I face in this area is that I think that sometimes it can perpetuate a culture of laziness, which is difficult to get around because oftentimes students are convinced that the machine, artificial intelligence, can do a better job than they can, and that it's not worth going through the trouble to do the job themselves. I think that's really bad because, I mean, I had this one student who I gave an article to read, 20 pages, not very complicated, and he just really had to skim it. But his default was kind of to put it into ChatGPT and get a summary of it from there. But there could have been really interesting things in that article that ChatGPT would not have picked up. And if he didn't ask ChatGPT the right questions, then it probably wouldn't have picked up those things. So I think that's difficult, is to rely on AI to give you everything that you might need, especially when you might not know what all you actually need.
Interesting. So, actually, on that, is there when I think of this default mode you're saying, which is becoming like a behavioral change, is to just go to a platform to get the summary, get the one pager on everything. If it's a book, I want the shortest, like the summary of that book. If it's one liner, from a summary to one liner, we're just going into like shortening things out. Again, it seems like an after effect of not seeing how this fits into the actual learning process or how it fits into there. There is no sense of like how can this actually be a learning opportunity? It's more so a an opportunity to get things done. So it seems like there's something missing with the incentives. What is incentivizing someone to do this? Like,
Right.
how can we fix those incentives? Like, what is the how can we how can we go about fixing those incentives?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really difficult question. I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think it's more about kind of, I think there's two things probably. One is to sort of show people how, um, without the right prompts, you can't get what you require from AI. So, for example, if you upload a particular PDF into AI and you just say, give me everything, in this PDF that has something to do with education, or give me everything that you would need, that you can take from this PDF in order for me to make an argument about X topic. Sometimes the AI will not be able to give you everything that you might require because that's not a very rich prompt that you're putting into the first place. So I think one is to show people how if you put in a prompt that's not particularly specific or well thought out, the machine is going to miss out on a lot of things. So to actually show what those gaps are, like, look, there's this thing in the machine, in the document that the machine did not pick up, right? And then people are like, okay, clearly I did need to actually read this document for myself or think about the prompt better. So one thing is sort of like showing the gaps that come along if you don't give the right prompts. And the second is to show what actually can be achieved if you do give the right prompts, I think. But the good thing is that giving the right prompt does require some level of thinking for oneself about what one wants. So maybe showing that is would be helpful.
It's much more about asking the right questions.
Yeah. I think asking the right questions is a great educational outcome. So to that extent, prompt engineering seems great.
Actually, what are the kinds of questions that you would ask a 12th grader that's now about to go to college to give them maybe like to help them understand better what paths that they can go about pursuing through college?
Yeah, apparently I asked really difficult questions to them. That's what they often tell me. But the questions are very simple. It's like, why do you want to study the subject? Like, what do you think the subject is? How does it connect with other subjects? What do you think you're going to miss out if you don't study these subjects? They're very, very simple questions, but I think students stumble with these ones.
What
And
about what about
no, I was just saying the same way that you're going with me, Sarthak. You're asking me questions, letting them lead to the next. It's the same thing that
yeah, it's sort of like understanding what you get back as a response and then kind of going further into it, deeper into it, understanding that. Is that something that you would do similarly for? I would assume that since you're very interested in people and educating in a different way in that age group, you're probably also curious about maybe people like in their 20s and how they kind of think about themselves. Is that something that you think about at all? Like friends, more of your friends that are in their 20s and having these conversations with them?
Sorry, so you're saying to thinking about people in the 20s for what purpose? Like to run programs for them, or do you mean something else?
More so for asking them similar questions on what drives them or where are they headed. Are these kind of conversations you ask of them too?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always nice to understand why people in different professions are motivated to remain in those professions because their answers can help me guide my younger students better.
Hmm.
So,
Do you have
because
any instances of, go ahead,
go ahead.
any instances of over the last year where a conversation like that with an older person, like in their 20s, has helped you with something for these students?
I think it's just really understanding the way that they think. So I have a friend who's an economist. I have a friend who's applying for a PhD in economics. I have friends who are from different subjects, many who are entrepreneurs, many who are actually working in politics, policy. Everyone in these different fields, I think, thinks in a different type of way. And I try to understand how they approach problems. So, for example, I have this one, this is very, very random, but I have a friend who's doing his PhD in economics. And when he talks about almost anything, he speaks a lot with his hands. And he does motions like this and this and this, even if he's talking about someone's mood, you know. But I know that he thinks in graphs. That's just how he thinks. He thinks about how things change over time and whether they go up and down. And sometimes you just get a glimpse of that in students you interact with who are in the 12th, 11th, 10th, ninth grade. And you see that they may have an intuition for thinking in this particular way. So you might want to give them something that exposes them. I mean, you might want to expose them to a field where that type of thinking is the most valuable. That's not on the front of motivations for why one becomes an economist, etc. It's more a matter of sort of just how you approach the world. Yeah.
Right. Right. And that, I'm guessing there's certain careers that sort of naturally are driven to think like that. So it makes sense to see that early on and then maybe see what how that connects to a career later on.
Exactly. Yeah.
That requires a lot of observation as a teacher, for example, or even as a parent.
Right. 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 I think that's true. I think parents would do really well to actually, now that you're mentioning this, you're so right. I think parents would do, we often think in this whole pre-college kind of space as the parent as the customer and the student as the consumer. But I think the parent can also be a consumer because the parent is ultimately an educator at home and places like that. The parent is making a lot of decisions for their child, or at least in collaboration with their child, exposing not just students to academics from around the world, young professionals from around the world, or whatever we do in this pre-college industry. I think it's really important to run programs like that for parents too. I don't know if people who are 45 to 50 years old know a lot of people who are between the ages of 25 to 30 who are doing a lot of work in the space of impact and alternate careers, things like that. And they've obviously had a very different type of education than these people have had. So I think that would actually be a really important intervention to make.
Yeah, it almost feels like, I mean, that has to start so early on as a process since we're developing as young kids, literally, maybe, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, like that age. Because, I mean, that's when so many of these principles are being laid out, or just simply like imitation, kids imitating their parents and seeing what they are like those sort of things are hardly they're not actively reflected on because you're sort of just like living life as a parent with your child. But there, if you actually are thinking through those, like what is it that, like, what are the values that I actually want to instill, and what are the values that what are the, like, how can I be more observant of my child as they're growing up, and like maybe when they're conscious enough to have that conversation with them, let them know, like, hey, these are things that I actually saw you like doing, and these might be natural proclivities you have, and then maybe even help them pursue those things much earlier on.
Right, 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 right.
I wanted to touch on this last topic on skills. A lot of the conversation we've had is around like the relationship you have with the real world, and then yourself, and then the subjects that are out there. But when it comes to the skills that you think are most important, like underlying these behaviors, underlying these, like the motivation that you have to pursue certain things and like find more of the things that like light you up, your purpose as a student, pursue the jobs that are more fulfilling. What are some skills you think are like foundational that will help younger people navigate the modern world successfully?
Right. I was having a panel discussion with some parents who have students in grades 9, 10, 11, 12. And one parent told me that she has a daughter who's at NYU and has the younger son or daughter in high school. And one of the challenges that her older daughter faces is that at college, she finds it really difficult to ask for help from her professors. Because growing up in India, we've been told that if we ask for help, that means we're dumb. So I think skills of how to put yourself out there, network, build connections, ask for help, take advantages of the resources that are around you, not feel as though you don't have the right to use them, being shameless is a highly American quality in the best way possible. I think
Yes.
these are really important qualities for us to develop in our students. So really empower them to just go out there and make opportunities for themselves. Even at RECO, one of the students that I have on as an intern right now is someone who randomly reached out to me. And she's been an absolutely brilliant asset for me to have this whole time. So being able to sort of put yourself out there and make opportunities for yourself, I think is really great. I think along with that, though, we do need to also train people to do that in the right way, because you cannot come to a meeting unprepared. You cannot ask for a meeting unless you have something specific to ask during the meeting, etc. So I think this area of kind of asking for help but also being prepared to receive help is really something that I think is very important to develop. Besides that, I think it's more the general things that people have spoken about for a long time: growth mindset, grit, courage. I think discipline is really, really important. Personally, I think journaling is extremely important. We don't do that at all in school. And it takes a lot of discipline to journal because it can be emotionally difficult to do. So I think something in the area of navigating your emotions in a structured way would be a really important skill as well. So that's the more internal one. How do you develop a proper relationship with yourself? And then the other one is how do you develop a proper relationship with someone else?
That's brilliantly put, honestly. The journaling stuff is, do you also have a practice of your own or your journal?
I'm really indisciplined about it, is basically the problem. But yeah, I have had that in my life, and sometimes I go back and forth through that. Oftentimes I go to my journal and the first sentence I typed is, the first sentence I type is, I can't believe it's been so long since I last journaled. But it does help. It helps a lot.
This reminds me of how I was able to get past the obstacle of journaling was by taking voice notes. And
Hmm.
it seems like a at that moment I was like, wow, maybe I'm kind of like tricking myself into not actually journaling. But I've noticed that just switching the voice notes app on and just pressing record and just saying what comes to mind has been very helpful for me while like just walking or just like outside or in my room. And from there, it became easier to like translate those when I saw those thoughts into words, and it made the process of writing stuff down after that much easier for me. So I start off with voice because that's something that we do regardless of everyday existence is just us talking. We might not write as much at all anymore, but we are talking all the time. So that's been like a little hack for me personally to like journal more consistently.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's also something that we should be taught in school is how to sort of fully understand and assess our own thoughts. I mean, sometimes when I'm planning something out, it's very difficult to sort of start because you have a blank. It's like the fear of the blank page. You have all these ideas racing all around in your head, and you've got a blank page, and you've got to somehow in a structured way put them down. And I think that the opportunity to do something like that is going to come up more and more because there will be more opportunities for us all to be extremely creative, and it can be very difficult to kind of put things down. And the reason I thought about this is because what I often do is I put on a voice memo and I just blow like blab, so I talk about, okay, these are the different things I need to work on, etc., or this is kind of my line on thinking on a particular issue. But I think one other skill, it would be sort of structured creative thinking, because creative thinking is going to, opportunities for that will increase, demand for that will increase, both because it's an enjoyable thing and because that's where a lot of innovative ideas come from. But to do it in a structured way, I think is really, really important.
I think I mean, walking is super underrated. I think as an exercise to just get yourself to think more creatively. Like there's a point I think after maybe like for me it's like after like half an hour or so where there is no there are no it's just the thoughts that are floating up are just floating up and random associations are being made and I'm able to connect things more. I mean, most of the questions that I came up for this podcast, for example, came up while I was just walking and I was just thinking about, okay, what do I think of when I think of Paritosh? How does it connect to this? What are things that I've read about it before? Okay, I need to understand this. It's a very therapeutic exercise, and I think it's such a I mean free of cost first of all, and pretty much accessible to anyone to just start like the thinking process. So I feel like that's another way to what you're saying is access creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for joining. I think we touched on most of these questions through this conversation, from what I see. Anything you want to discuss further?
No, I think we're good. It's been lovely.
Well, thank you, man. I will stop recording here, and then you can just